Contrary to popular belief, you do not need a degree to study history. And in today's video, I'm going to be sharing my 4-step process to becoming a historian. Now, a little bit of context. My name is Kaylin. I'm a 5th-year PhD candidate in history and African American studies at Yale University. I study legal history and have been studying history formally at university for many, many years. And although there are some in the academy who believe that you cannot be a proper historian unless you have the academic training, I argue that's a quite exclusionary perspective, and that especially in this political climate, we need more people that are interested in and are studying history in order to inform ourselves and the people around us. So this video is very near and dear to my heart, and I want you to feel empowered to study history whether you have had formal training or you have not. I want you to feel like you can study and discuss history with your peers regardless of if you have gone and received a degree in that subject matter. I'm also going to share a couple of resources for programs that you can look up if you want more formal education but don't necessarily have the means or the circumstances to make a formal degree or a formal full-time program work for you. I am a big advocate for mature and non-traditional students, so regardless of your age, your background, your training up until this point, I personally believe that you can and should study history. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and jump straight into it with the first stage in your history journey, which is what I'm calling the gateway. The gateway can be basically anything that introduces you to topics in history. This can be popular media, so this includes YouTube videos, documentaries, historical fiction, period dramas. I personally found my way into a love of history by watching documentaries. I have a very vivid memory of being a kid going to an IMAX theater with my mom to go see the Ken Burns Lewis and Clark documentary. I personally love Ken Burns. You know, he is a tiny bit controversial, but ultimately I find that his documentaries are very well balanced, incredibly well researched, and he brings in a load of historians and scholars that I truly respect. The Lewis and Clark documentary that I watched as a kid was that kind of gateway into an interest in history, because history is storytelling. Historians have this process of going and looking at primary source documents, so that's documents and artifacts from the time that they're studying, and being able to craft a story around it. Now, a common misconception about historians is that we look at primary sources and we cherry pick and we manipulate it. But as you'll find throughout this video, there are processes that professional historians go through in order to learn how to look at these primary sources. And so I think it's really important to develop a just general interest in the storytelling of history at the very beginning, because that is the most accessible point for the general public. We all have access to things like YouTube, we have access to things like popular social media, but we can also watch things like films as a way to begin developing an interest in a time period or a subject. For example, if you're somebody that watches period dramas like Pride and Prejudice, then you may start having questions about the costuming and whether or not that costuming is accurate to the time period. You may ask questions about how it is that those buildings were created. You may also have questions about the economics and the wealth that is accrued by aristocratic members of that film, such as Mr. Darcy, because Mr. Darcy, although he is a fictional character, is a stand-in for discussing the wealth accrued and the behaviors of the upper class in Georgian era England. It's just a nice introduction and a way to begin asking questions about history and developing it out of your own interest. That's what leads me to part 2, or stage 2, which is the question. The thing that's going to take you from step 1 to step 2 is having those questions by interacting critically with the media that you are consuming. Whether that's historical fiction or it's documentary, you begin asking questions about the subjects that are selected and perhaps who is not selected. For example, you may have questions about people within period dramas that are not shown. And this is what leads to an interest in studies of social history. I personally love social and legal history, and social history is essentially a study of people and how it is that they interact with one another and how it is that they impact the actions of others and what their day-to-day life might look like. Now, there are various strains of social history, but my personal favorite is just looking at how people lived their day-to-day lives, how they interacted with one another, how they communicated, what they ate, what their environment was like, what might they have seen, what might they have experienced in their lifetime. Those are the questions that I had. Whether you're watching a documentary from someone like Ken Burns with the PBS station, or you are watching something on YouTube, the question that I want you to begin asking is why it is that they have selected certain subjects, so certain people to highlight. I also recommend going a step further and actually looking up the scholars that they cite or the source material that they mention. For example, many people will watch a documentary or watch a film about the founding of the United States, but will never actually read the Declaration of Independence. So this stage of your history study journey is to begin questioning and using that inquisitive intuition to begin doing a little bit of digging. This might also be the stage in which you start picking up historical books, and this includes historical nonfiction. My personal gateway into reading historical nonfiction was actually reading a lot of biographies back when I was in community college and was beginning to develop an interest in history. I actually picked up Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, An American Controversy by Annette Gordon Reed. And this book was actually why I ended up going into African American studies when I transferred to university. It was because of the way that Gordon Reed highlights the experiences of Sally Hemings and the Hemings family overall, and provided a lot of context to the legal backdrop of the time period, that I began wanting to know more about the experiences of Black women in early America. And this is what I encourage you to do, is looking for biographies and other types of historical nonfiction material that you can begin reaching for and digging further into. The reason this is important is because it's going to begin offering you recommendations and citations for further inquiry. And that is what leads us to stage 3, which is the student. When you start reading historical nonfiction, you're going to be introduced to a series of citations, whether that is a footnote, endnotes, or the index. Every historian that has published historical nonfiction must cite their sources, whether that's a primary source from the time period itself or it's secondary literature from other historians. And this is what you learn when you first become a student at university studying history, is you begin to understand the difference between primary and secondary literature. So I'm just going to quickly break it down for you because I think it's important to highlight. A primary source is anything from the time period. We've discussed this already. This includes documents. It also includes oral testimony. It can also include things like photographs and artworks. However, historians primarily deal with documentary sources. And what's important about primary sources is it gives us a bit of a mirror into the time period itself. However, when you are a student, you begin to actually question the primary sources themselves. And you begin to recognize that even newspapers, personal papers, whatever it may be, posit a particular kind of bias. And so you want to begin asking questions about what that document was intended for, who was intended to read it, and was the original writer potentially aware that that document may be read years after their death. For example, a lot of the papers of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, between them and their wives, were actually burned after the death of their spouse, therefore demonstrating that the papers that remained were pieces of history that they wanted to be seen by others, or that they assumed might be seen by others, but that they burned and destroyed any material that they did not want seen by others. And that's what's really interesting about history, is actually looking at those primary sources and trying to figure out what its intention was, who was intended to read it. So those are primary sources, and those are some of the questions that you begin asking when you're in the early stages of your training as a historian. Now, the second piece to consider is secondary literature. Secondary literature is anything written about that particular time period. So this is the work of historians. This is the work of scholars in other fields. It can also be a reaction to that material, the primary source material. And what's important about secondary literature and about historical work in general is that everybody that works as a historian is presenting a new perspective on very similar documentation, or they're presenting new evidence to the field and their perspective on that evidence. Now, historians, as all human beings, has a bit of bias. It's based on their training, it's based on who they've worked with, it's based on the documents that they actually cite. And so when you're looking at secondary literature, what's really important is not just the primary sources that they're looking at and their argument, but also which historians they are in dialogue with. And this is something that you are introduced to in the later stages of your undergraduate training and potentially into your early graduate training as a historian in academia. And while a lot of this material, the secondary source material, can sometimes be hidden behind paywalls because of the inaccessibility of certain journals, there are ways around it. For example, getting a library card or other types of institutional access. This includes peer-reviewed monographs. When I say peer-reviewed, what I mean is that the actual book has been reviewed and approved by a group of other scholars. And this is a process that every historian who is academically trained has to go through in order to get their work published. And that's why there's a little bit of a difference between trade press publishing and academic university press publishing. Now, popular press publishing, such as this book here or this one here, have often not gone through the rigorous peer review process. However, if you see a title such as this that is produced by a university press, or this one, then you know that it has been approved by a peer review committee. The reason I highlight this is because oftentimes there is a perception that historians' biases are going to get in the way of truth. And what you learn in this stage as a student is how it is that primary sources are reviewed and analyzed, and how it is that we are also responsible to our field of study in order to build upon or potentially argue against our peers that have also posited an argument about that material. And this is where I'm going to give you some specific resources in order to develop your student journey as a historian. And that is where I recommend checking out online courses and other types of programs in order to begin this process of training your brain to question essentially everything, but to begin thinking about the intention behind a primary source, a secondary source, and seeing how it is that those things are blended together in order to give us a fuller picture of what happened at that time or to that subject or within that region. Back when I was in community college, I actually used to watch a lot of the Yale University courses online. They're available for free on YouTube. This is not a recommendation because I'm a Yale student. It's just because they do have a lot of courses. I really love Joanne Freeman's course on the American Revolution. There's also a class, I believe, by David Blight about the Civil War. You've got courses by Timothy Snyder on the history of Ukraine. And so I just recommend finding courses from actual university professors and historians that you can just absorb and you don't have to pay to access. Now, if you want further training, that's when I recommend actually signing up for a smaller course. So whether that's through, for example, Coursera or an extension school. So Harvard has an extension school. I believe UCLA has an extension school. Many of the major universities, especially research institutions, will have extension programs that aren't degreed, but you can potentially get a certificate for signing up. Now, the only challenge with that is that it's not terribly accessible in terms of that you have to pay a fee in order to participate, but it's something to consider if you want to take it seriously and really work alongside a scholar who's going to check your work and offer feedback and be able to converse with you about your interests. Another option is to also check out summer programs. There are summer programs, for example, in the departments of continuing education. These departments exist in many of the major universities around the world, but I know especially the ones that are here in the UK, and they're ideal for mature and returning students because there's not a specific degree requirement. And you get to spend, a week or even several weeks in a program at a university in order to continue your training. Now, if you are interested in a degree, there are many other programs that, extension schools or continuing education departments have available. And I've also worked with students that have gone back to school after several years of taking a break or even decades of taking a break. So there's definitely options for you if you want to pursue this formally. However, I'm just trying to give you a couple of options because at the end of the day, the interest in history is all about wanting to explore the past, wanting to better understand why certain things happen, to better understand from various perspectives. That is the work of history. That is the work of historians. That is the work of multiple generations of historians that have built out series of trends within the historiography in order to posit new questions that lead to a whole new body of literature. So you don't need a degree, but those are a couple of the options that you might be willing to pursue if you're interested. And I'll have some of the links down below. I have no remuneration from this. This isn't sponsored. It's just some resources that I wish I had known back in community college that I think might be useful to you. And lastly, we have stage 4, which I am calling the graduation into being a historian. And this applies a lot of the same training that you would get as a graduate student. A graduate student works on a specific topic, and this is often the misconception about what historians do. We don't have knowledge of every single historical subject. We don't even really have knowledge of our general subfield overall. We can teach classes on it by doing the reading and doing some training and setting up our lectures, but oftentimes we are specialists. And we're specialists in a very specific topic. And that's where our questions just get further and further narrowed. Now, personally, I study matrilineal descent and the law of slavery in the early modern English Atlantic. I know that's a mouthful, but what I'm looking at is the principle of the mother's condition, so their legal status, being passed generationally onto their kin, and how it is that that goes against the kind of paternalistic nature of English law, and how by instating it they established an intergenerational system of racial slavery. And what I'm looking at is the origin. So where does this matrilineal descent concept come from? It is very gendered, but I'm also looking at the kind of generational component and the relationship between parents and their children. And so as you get into this 4th stage, you begin specializing and you begin looking at a very specific topic and a specific research question. And in order to answer those questions, you have to use archival material. So that is using documentary sources in order to begin answering your questions. You use the secondary literature in order to help you craft that question. So when we look at the work of other historians, we see what it is that they have argued, how it is that they've used evidence to make that argument, and whether or not we agree with their position. Oftentimes it's quite nuanced. It's not that you flat out disagree with another scholar, but that their use of the evidence, you would say, is not substantial in being able to posit that argument and being able to support that argument. Your job as a historian, as somebody who is presenting new knowledge to the field, is to show either new sets of evidence or review the previous evidence and show a new perspective, make a new argument, or potentially strengthen the argument of the previous scholar. And that is what we call engaging in discourse. Engaging with other scholars as well as primary sources is one of the primary ways that historians are trained, and is what separates somebody who I would say is a hobbyist as a historian versus somebody who is in the realm of becoming a professional historian. Now, many academics may disagree with me, but I have met plenty of historians, professional historians, I would argue, that do not have the training in history, but that do the work, that do the research, and that offer new insights into the past, and are therefore making a contribution to the field and to the public. Therefore, if you love history, I believe that you should feel empowered to pursue it, that you should feel empowered to develop your own historical research, to begin looking at historical material, because the more people we have interested in history, the stronger our field is. And I believe that we should make history as accessible to everyone as possible, because history is important. It informs our understanding of human beings. It informs our understanding of ourselves. It informs our experiences of government systems, and also allows us to recognize patterns of human behavior, whether that's at the governmental level or the personal level. History is a very human pursuit of the truth, and I hope that you pursue it as well. thank you so much for watching. I hope that you enjoyed this video and that you check out the resources down below. And if there's any further resources that you recommend, especially for those of you that are mature and returning students or historians that are working in the public sphere, I would love to see your recommendations in the comments. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you all very soon. Thanks, friends.